The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, but I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round again, the years keep rolling by.
When I was growing up in the 1950s and 1960s, it was assumed that if you were a bright girl and your family could afford it, you would go to college. And when you graduated, you had 4 choices: teacher, librarian, nurse, or wife. But when I graduated from college in 1972, I had many more choices. Recently, I read Betty Friedan's memoir, Life So Far, and realized that I had had many more choices in part because of Betty Friedan and her book, The Feminine Mystique. Now, when I was reading her memoir, I found it fascinating and quite surprising. I had always assumed, based on no data, that Betty had been born an activist and had been pushing the envelope every moment of her life. But that was not the case at all. She grew up in the Midwest in the 20s and 30s, and she was a bright girl whose family could afford her to send her to college, and she had the same 4 choices when graduating: teacher, or assumed she'd have the same 4 choices: teacher, librarian, nurse, or wife. Now, she went to Smith College, and she won the freshman honors prize. She became a psychology major, and she was the editor of the newspaper. And she changed it from being a weekly newspaper to coming out several times during the week. She got enough advertisers to support it. She got enough staff to fill the pages. She was quite a compliment to the Smith campus. And at Smith, the Smith graduates had a couple of other choices. That it was assumed that if you were very good in your major, you would go on to graduate school. Or if you were a good writer, you would go to New York City and do research for a magazine until you were married. Betty wrote in her memoir, "It never occurred to me that as editor of a college newspaper, I was qualified to work for perhaps even the New York Times or another big city newspaper. I know my counterparts at Yale and Harvard were expecting to do just that, but it never occurred to me, even though working on a newspaper was what I had loved most in everything that I had done in my life." Well, Betty was, as I said, a psychology major, and she won a 1-year fellowship to UC Berkeley. So off she went to UC Berkeley. During a faculty symposium, she presented her honors thesis that she had written at Smith. And afterwards, her advisor said, "Betty, that was fabulous. You could have used that as your master's thesis or even your PhD dissertation." Based on that, the psychology faculty nominated Betty for the largest fellowship given to scientists at UC Berkeley, and she won it. It had never been won by a psychologist before, never been won by a woman. Betty's asthma got worse, and she broke out in welts all over her body. Her boyfriend, a physicist whom she was mooning over, took her for a walk on the hills above UC Berkeley to give her a break from everything that was going on. She said, "Oh, Bob, thank you. It's so good to get away from campus for a little while." And he said, "Betty, we're through. I could never win a fellowship like that." Betty wrote, "I was crushed." And then she decided to forget about a career and just concentrate on being a woman. Remember, this was now 1943. Freud was really big in the psychology field, and Freud wrote, "It is woman's nature to be ruled by man, and her sickness to envy him." Yeah. So Betty did not accept the fellowship, which would have taken her all the way through her PhD, paid for all of her classes and everything else. She dropped out of grad school. I thought, Betty, you didn't need to drop out of grad school. You just needed to find a more supportive boyfriend. Well, maybe there weren't a lot of them around in 1943. I don't know. Yeah. So Betty did go to New York City and work for a newspaper, but it was a newspaper run by a labor union. So it wasn't the high-ranking, no. She got married the following year to a man who worked in the theater as a stage manager. So his job wasn't the kind of, steady employment that a family might need. Betty continued working, and she always felt badly when she made more money than he did. The next year, she had a baby. She took a year's leave of absence and then went back to work. A few years later, she got pregnant again, and she was fired. She wasn't even given any reason why. But then she found out she was fired because she was pregnant. And Betty finally got mad. I was proud of her then. She went to the head of her union and said, "I want you to file a grievance. This isn't fair. I was fired because I was pregnant." "It's your own fault." "File a grievance for me." He just shrugged. Betty wrote, "There was no term at that time as sex discrimination, but I knew it wasn't right. I was fiercely aware of the injustice of it. But I decided to become a freelance writer and write articles for women's magazines." Her asthma came back, and when she went to her psychoanalyst, he said, "Betty, maybe your problem is that you need to be a more serious writer." "Oh, I can't do that." "Betty, didn't you graduate summa cum laude from Smith? You should take yourself more seriously." "Oh, I can't do that." But finally, in 1957, 3 things happened that changed the way Betty looked at things. The first was she read an article about written by 2 Freudian psychoanalysts, a man and a woman. This article said that perhaps American women were not content with their role as wives because they were overeducated. Now, how a woman who was a psychoanalyst, who was clearly overeducated and had a career, could write that, I don't know. But Betty also finally got really mad. She said, "How could they write that? I valued my education, even though I didn't feel I used it particularly well. And how could my education make me a worse wife and mother? I had bought everything Freud had been selling. Hadn't I given up my big fellowship at Berkeley and dropped out of grad school? Hadn't I given up my career as a newspaper reporter? But this was too much." The second thing that happened was that Betty was asked to write a questionnaire for her class reunion. It was their 15th reunion. When she analyzed the results, she found that women who were just, their lives were completely in the box of wife and mother were depressed or frustrated. And those who had outside interests were more content with life. And those who didn't even recognize that the box existed were really thriving. The third thing that happened was at the reunion. Betty came back to the dormitory she was staying in late and found that she and some of the seniors were locked out. She asked them, "Do you still have curfews?" "Oh, yes. One of us has gone to get the janitor. He'll let us in a little while." So Betty said, remembering the wonderful time she had had at Smith. "What courses were you really interested in?" And they all looked at her and said, "We just went to school here." Well, and one said, "I'm really interested in my future with my fiance. Every weekend I visit him and we discuss his career and where we're going to live. I want to have 4 children and live somewhere where I can ice skate with them a lot during the winter." Betty said, "Weren't there any campus groups that you were active in that you enjoyed, like the school government or the newspaper?" "Oh no, we weren't interested in that. We're just looking forward to our future." Betty couldn't believe it. Those 4 choices were now down to 1, wife. And she wanted to figure out what had happened. So she wrote an article for McCall's magazine suggesting that women were not happy with their role in American life, not because they were overeducated, but because the role was not right. McCall's declined to publish that. A number of other magazines declined to publish it. So Betty wrote a book. She researched it for 5 years. As part of her research, she discovered that Freud had written a letter to a colleague that said, "Despite my studying women for over 30 years, I still do not know what women want most." Now, at this point, I got really mad because I knew the story of Sir Gawain and Dame Ragnell, which was in the 5th century, a King Arthur tale. And what women want most is their sovereignty, their right to make choices. And it was known in the 5th century. And Freud was studying women for 30 years, and he didn't trip over that little fact. And he had the nerve to write about women, even though he didn't know what women wanted most. I also was a psychology major, but I had never bought into what Freud was selling, especially this penis envy business. I mean, I have personally never experienced penis envy. The closest I ever came was when hiking, and I would desperately be looking for an outhouse instead of a substantial bush. And then there was a little envy, but it was only because it was exterior plumbing, not what Freud was trying to sell. And the uterus. Now, the uterus is a nifty organ, but you never hear about uterus envy. But this is a digression. Back to Betty. So Betty's research, not surprisingly, discovered that Freud's idea of women's role was a major cause of the feminine mystique. That's what she called the idea that women should be satisfied with just the role of wife and mother. She concluded that while perhaps it had been true in Vienna in Freud's time, it wasn't true anymore. She ended her book, "The feminine mystique is no longer a valid guide to women's lives because it is obsolete. A woman has the power to choose and to make her own heaven or hell." The book was published in 1963. Betty was 42 years old. It made the New York Times bestsellers list. In fact, it only fell off the New York Times bestsellers list when her astonished publisher couldn't keep up with the demand. And once the books got back out into the bookstores, it went right back on the bestsellers list. She sold 3 million copies in the first 3 years. Whenever she spoke, women would come up to her afterwards and say, "I'm so glad you wrote that book. I thought I was the only one who felt out of place." Now, the Friedan family were suddenly wealthy. They bought an apartment in the Dakota Building on Central Park West in New York City, where John Lennon lived, and a summer home on Fire Island off of Long Island. That was the public part of what happened with the feminine after the feminine mystique. The private part, Betty's husband started beating her up. A colleague in the women's movement later wrote, At that time, if you knew you were going to be on television with Betty Friedan, you always showed up early to help her with her makeup to hide her black eyes. At least once, her husband tried to push her out of a moving vehicle. Luckily, a friend witnessed this, had her husband stop the car. The friend got Betty into his car and he drove Betty home. He happened to be a divorce lawyer. He said, "Betty, you can stop all this. Divorce him." "I can't divorce him. I need a husband to take me places. I'm a Smith graduate. Smith graduates don't get divorced." "Betty, he could have killed you just then. Get a divorce. Stop all this." "I can't get a divorce." It hurt me so much that while Betty could fight for women, she couldn't fight for herself. She stayed with her husband for 6 more years, only divorcing him finally when she said, "I was afraid that the scar tissue around my eyes from all the black eyes was going to become permanent." Some choices are hard to make. Perhaps some activists are born pushing the envelope every moment of their lives, but others, like Betty, are forged by the events in their lives. I am so very glad that Betty wrote that book, The Feminine Mystique, in time for me. Because when I graduated from college in '72, I had lots of choices. I chose to become a computer programmer. I also married right out of college, but I continued working. I got my master's degree one course at a time while working, both before and after our son was born. And I continued working, which was just as well because my husband was laid off when he was 50 and our son was 12. He chose to go to law school. Because I had a good job, I was able to support our family during that 3-year period. My husband was pleased I could do that, and so was I. Choices. Aren't they what everyone wants?
When I was a young woman, I lived in Dublin, and I worked at Trinity College in the library at Trinity College. And I lived sharing a house with a lovely woman called Greta Ruddy. And Miss Greta Ruddy was a retired school ma'am, very prim and very proper. And we shared a house. I had a small living room and kitchen upstairs and a bedroom. We shared a bathroom. And she had upstairs her bedroom, and then downstairs she had the normal house, so living room, dining room, kitchen. Now, in her living room, she had a telephone. I did not have a telephone. Back in the 1970s, hardly anyone had a telephone. Nowadays, everyone has a telephone. But back then, if Greta was around the house, I could go into her living room and use her phone. Right outside my front gate was a big Dublin telephone kiosk. All my friends had the telephone number of that Dublin kiosk. It was quite big. 2 or 3 people could fit inside it, and it was painted pale green and dark green, and the word TELEFON printed in big bold letters above the door, and it was brightly lit, and you put 6pence in the coin slot and you got a local call. So if I needed to make a call when Greta wasn't around, I would slip outside to the phone kiosk, and all my friends had that number. And if I knew they were calling at a certain time, I could be upstairs with my window open, listening to hear that phone ring. And if sometimes I didn't hear the phone ring and a passerby did, they would knock on my door and say, "Phone call for you." So it worked out wonderfully well. So this particular evening, I had taken a bath and got dressed for bed, put on my nightie. But I remembered I was expecting a call at 9 p.m. So I thought, well, I'm not going to go upstairs and change. I won't be long outside. It's a lovely summer's evening. I'll just slip out like this in my nightie and slippers and get the call and be back in 10 minutes. So about 9:05, I went out and stood by the phone booth and waited. And usually my friend is very punctual. But that particular night, he was a good 5-10 minutes late calling me. So I stood out there. And then he did call. We concluded our conversation in about 5 minutes. And I went to re-enter the house. My key was going in the lock, but the door was not opening. Then I realized the deadbolt was on the front door. So I was banging on the door, ringing on the doorbell, calling Greta's name. Greta was not hearing a thing. She took out her hearing aids, took 2 sleeping pills, and was sound asleep. So I'm stranded out there with no money, no pocketbook, no coat, wondering how I'm going to get in. So I go back to the phone booth and I phone the operator, who happened to be a young Irish lad, and I said, could you help me? I'm locked out of my house, and if you could please ring this phone number inside my house, I think Greta will hear the phone, and when she comes to the phone, tell her, Anne-Marie is locked outside the front door, please open the door. And he was laughing. He thought this was hilarious. And he said, I will do that. He said, I will call the number. And sure enough, that very kind gentleman, every couple of minutes, he was ringing that number. And I was out on the street and I could hear it loudly going, bring, bring. Why she couldn't hear it, I don't know, but I could hear it clearly outside on the road. So I was banging on the door, ringing on the bell. The phone was bringing every few minutes. Greta was not stirring. After about an hour out there, I was beginning to get a little bit worried about what I was now going to do, when up the street came the local police guardie. Now, I lived on a beautiful, beautiful street. Griffith Avenue in Dublin is one of the most prestigious, beautiful streets. Big, wide boulevard, tree-lined the whole way down, and the homes were beautiful. I was very fortunate to live on such a beautiful street. So I see the officer coming towards me, and I thought, I'd better talk to this fellow and explain my predicament. So I stopped him, and I explained, I live here. So he said, do you have any ID on you? No, I didn't have any ID on me. But when Greta would open the door, she would confirm I did indeed live there. So he immediately leapt into the rescue the damsel in distress mode. And he told me his name was Seamus. Now, Seamus had a friend who lived 4 or 5 doors up on Griffith Avenue who was a roofer. And the roofer would have a ladder. And he would go and get the ladder and bring it back and knock on Greta's upstairs front bedroom window. And I would get in. I thought, sounds like a plan. Good idea. So he said, it's getting cold. Why don't you wait inside the telephone booth while I go get the ladder? I said, good idea. So I go back into the telephone booth, and I'm standing there. And he had gone about 2 doors up when he turned back and looked at me. I don't know what he was thinking, but he came racing back, yanked open the door of the telephone booth and said, you don't look decent at all. He says, get out of there, hide in the bushes. And I'm thinking, hide in the bushes? Why have I got to hide in the bushes? He said, you don't look decent at all. Apparently the light in the telephone was shining through my nightie. So I had to go hide in the bushes. And off he went to find the roofer friend. They weren't gone very long when a few minutes later, Seamus, the policeman, and his friend arrive with a big long ladder. And they proceed to have a big argument about which one of them is going up the ladder to knock on the door. Seamus thought it was his duty to go up the ladder since he was the police officer in charge of this case. But the roofer said, have you ever been up a ladder, Seamus? Seamus said, never been up a ladder. The roofer said, I go up and down ladders all day long. I'm safer to go up the ladder, and you're a bit, well, overweight. Seamus was a bit insulted at that remark, but indeed he was a little bit overweight. And the roofer kept saying, let me go up the ladder. And they kept arguing. And finally the roofer said, okay, if she did wake up, she would recognize that you are a police officer and she won't get such a fright, whereas I would be a stranger and she might get a bad fright. So yes, you go up the ladder. And I'm still hiding in the bushes. So Seamus goes up the ladder, and with his nightstick, he's banging and banging on the window. And Greta is still not moving. And the phone is still going, bring, bring. And I'm still ringing the doorbell and hiding in the bushes. After about 20 minutes, Greta finally wakes up. Now, I had been outside approximately 2 hours by this time. Now, it's a very lovely avenue, and the people who were out walking their dogs and walking home now are assembling around the front door, because this is some big goings-on going on Griffith Avenue this evening. So we now have quite a crowd of people around the ladder. And Greta wakes up and looks at the window, and she sees someone at the window. And poor Greta, she got the fright of her life. She almost had a heart attack. So she raced downstairs and phoned the police that there was someone breaking into her house on a ladder at the top bedroom window. Fortunately, there was a local Garda car. The police car was only about 2 blocks away. And they came zooming up to Griffith Avenue with the lights blaring, the siren going, and that attracted more people to come out and stand outside. And they were very surprised to see their colleague, Seamus, up the ladder, banging on the window. So finally Greta opened the window and peeked out, and she saw this big assembly of people and me, and she said, "Is that yourself, Anna Marie? What are you doing out there in your nightie?" And I said, "Well, it's a long story, Greta. Could you just unbolt the door and let me in?" So she did.
This is a story about civil rights in this country. I wonder if you remember how you registered to vote. I think all I did when I moved to Clifton Park was to show up at town hall with documents that proved who I was and where I now lived. I know my son just had to fill out a form in high school, and he became a registered voter. But for some people, it isn't that easy. Teresa Burrows from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, told her story as part of the StoryCorps project. She said, "I tried for 2 years to register to vote. The first Monday and third Monday of every month, I went with my minister, Reverend J.J. Simmons, to register to vote. The white men there just ignored us. They continued playing dominoes. I hadn't known how to play dominoes before I tried to register to vote. But after watching them for so many days, I knew how to play dominoes. When they did recognize that I was there, they just asked silly questions. I remember one day when Mr. Cox, he was the head of the registrars, I remember when he asked me, "How many red jelly beans are in that jar? How many black ones?" And I said, "You don't know how many there are." And he said, "You just shut your black mouth. Just shut up." Well, on the Sunday before the next Monday to go to register to vote, I told my minister, "I'm not going. I am not going to be embarrassed like that again." And Reverend Simmons said, "Do you want to vote?" I said, "Yes. We are going to go there as long as that building is there. Every time they open that door, we are going to walk through it. I'm going to pick you up at the regular time tomorrow. Be ready." And as it happened, that day, Mr. Cox asked me to recite the preamble from the Constitution. I don't think he knew it. But when I finished, he said, "Today you're going to get your cards to prove that you've registered to vote. We're tired of seeing your black faces around here." So that's how I got my card. We voted in the next election, and it was wonderful. But I thought it shouldn't have been that hard. I knew it shouldn't have been that hard. Now, as hard as it was for Teresa to register to vote, for other African Americans, it was much worse. Some African Americans who were tenant farmers, when the owners of their property found out that they had tried to register to vote, they got thrown off the property. Suddenly, there were families who had no place to live and no jobs just because they tried to register to vote. I wonder, what did they do? Where did they go? How did they survive? For some people, like my son and myself, registering to vote was a forgettable experience. But for others, it was something they remembered all the days of their lives.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, but I can't tell you why. Seasons stay